A child vanished into the freezing forest night, and not a single soul heard the desperate cry for help. Except for Ranger, the German shepherd once dismissed from duty for being no longer quick or sharp enough. But in the moment when every second meant survival or death, Ranger didn't wait for a command. Ranger chose from the heart. And when Tommy finally emerged, eyes locked in a haunting silence, it was Ranger, and only Ranger, who understood what the boy couldn't say. What shocked the entire town lay buried deep beneath the earth where Ranger chose to stop. The sky above Timber Hollow was veiled in a thin layer of mist, like an old silk scarf worn threadbare by time, gently stirred by the breeze as it passed through the solemn rows of pine. Jack Nolan parked his rusted pickup along the narrow dirt path leading to the old Miller farm, a place everyone in town now simply called the abandoned lot. The iron gate, twisted and rusted, slumped sideways into the knee-high weeds, half swallowed by years of neglect. The wooden planks of the main barn were warped and sun-bleached, arching like the bent backs of the forgotten. If it weren't for the anonymous call at 6 that morning, someone reporting strange noises from the old farm, Jack would have stayed at his desk, warm and far from the silence pressing against this place. Ranger leapt out of the truck bed in one smooth, grounded motion. The large German shepherd, thick black and dark tan fur running in a striking line down his back, landed quietly, ears perked, eyes scanning. He didn't wait for a signal. Ranger had long been used to taking the lead on his own. "Let's go, old man," Jack muttered softly, tightening the leash as he surveyed the scene. Nothing stood out. Just a collapsed barn, just as people had always said. But Ranger thought differently. Just as they approached the edge of the barn, Ranger came to a sudden stop. His eyes widened, nose pressed to the ground, and then, like something had switched inside him, he began to move, circling the perimeter with deliberate, focused steps. Jack followed, a quiet unease tightening his chest. Ranger never acted without cause. The faded scar on Ranger's left shoulder was the first thing Jack noticed the day they met, back at the K-9 military training facility. "Injured in the line," the trainer had said. "He fears nothing. But when he barks, sometimes it's not a warning, sometimes it's a plea." Jack crouched and placed a hand on Ranger's scruff. The fur along his neck stood straight. The muscles beneath tensed like coiled rope. Even the air around them felt suddenly still. "You sense something," Jack whispered. Ranger pressed his snout to the warped wood outside the old horse stable. And then Ranger barked. It wasn't a sharp bark, not a signal. It was deep, echoing, laden with urgency that pierced the skin. Jack flinched. Ranger barked again, louder, then again. The sound bounced across the empty yard, slammed against the cracked barn walls, and scattered into the silence like a siren from the past. "Easy now," Jack said under his breath, pulling out his radio, but stopped. Could be a wild animal, or maybe a bobcat. But Ranger's eyes said something else. They locked downward, fixed to a point beyond sight. Then, suddenly, Ranger stepped back and lunged forward, slamming both front paws against the floorboards with force. A dull, hollow thud shook the air, followed by a thick cloud of dust. Jack bent down. One plank, just one, looked newer than the rest. Less moss. No splintering. Office. He peeled it back carefully. Beneath it was a narrow gap, just enough to let a scent escape. Damp. Acrid, not like any abandoned stable Jack had smelled before. Ranger moved in close, a low growl rumbling in his throat. His body so tense, Jack could feel the vibration through the leash. A breeze passed, and then a sound. Not a bark, not wind. Something faint, like nails tapping against wood. One tap, Then silence. Then again. Jack froze. Ranger dropped into a sit, eyes never leaving the crack. Jack exhaled sharply, standing upright, gaze sweeping the woods. Call for backup? Or go in himself? His mind flicked to that winter morning in '97, the one when Ranger had tracked a missing boy through a frozen forest. Ranger had barked just like this, and under that patch of softened earth. They found the boy, cold, shivering, but alive. Jack drew his field knife and started to pry the boards up, careful not to make a sound. Ranger pressed in close beside him. The breeze returned, carrying with it the scent of old earth, and something else, something hard to name. Dust drifted down like soft snow as a thin beam of sunlight spilled through the pine canopy, catching on the floor's jagged cracks. Jack pulled back another plank, and there he saw it, disturbed soil, fresh, shifted. Suddenly a whisper rose from beneath, faint, barely more than breath. "Is anyone there?" Ranger froze, ears high, his entire body tight, drawn like a bowstring. Jack didn't hesitate now. He sprinted to the truck, grabbed the crowbar, dropped to his knees beside the gap, and jammed the tip into the edge of the plank. With a sharp wrench, the board gave way with a crack, revealing the mouth of a small underground chamber. A wave of humid air rushed upward, thick with earth and the sour staleness of time. Jack switched on his flashlight and pointed it down the hole. A narrow tunnel, no longer than 10 feet, ended in a wooden door. Rusted iron handle, worn and clawed like something, or someone, had scratched it again and again. Tiny handprints marked the dust. Ranger let out a soft, sharp whine. "Stay in guard," Jack whispered, then dropped in. The dirt floor was damp, springy underfoot. Someone had been here, recently. He crept forward, hand brushing against the tunnel wall. At the door, his fingers touched the cold iron. He hesitated for one breath, then pushed. The door creaked open, a mournful screech echoing into the dark. The space inside was cramped, barely tall enough for Jack to crouch. His flashlight swept the cement walls, and then stopped. Movement, 5 children. 4 huddled in the far corner, limbs tangled together like trembling shadows. One, a boy, maybe 8, stood in front of them, unmoving, watching. "I'm not here to hurt you," Jack said gently, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a police officer. My name's Jack. I'm here to bring you home." No answer, just quick, shallow breaths, eyes wide, locked on his. Jack lowered the flashlight, careful not to blind them. Dirt-smudged faces, pale skin, tangled hair. On one arm, a rope mark still red around a tiny wrist. No blood, but fear and exhaustion. The boy stepped forward, his eyes, black and sharp, glinted under the beam like 2 chips of stone. "Who sent you?" the boy asked, voice steady but small. Jack dropped to one knee, level with him. "No one," he said softly. "Just a dog. Ranger heard you calling." Helen nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, I was just curious." "What does that symbol mean, Tommy?" The boy stayed silent. Ranger let out a soft, low whimper, almost like a gentle reminder. Tommy lowered his head, his fingers absently twirling the pencil between them. "I remember. My mom used to draw it," he said, his voice quiet and deliberate. "She told me it was the eye of those who don't sleep." "The ones who don't sleep?" Helen echoed, her breath catching slightly. Tommy nodded. "They know everything. They can see in the dark." Helen held her breath. "When did she tell you that?" "Before she disappeared." Tommy stared at the blank sheet of paper in front of him. She said if someone ever asked about the missing children, I should just draw the eye. A shiver ran down Helen's spine, a chill not from the weather, but from something unspoken sliding into place. Do you remember anything else? She asked, her voice now almost a whisper. Tommy shook his head. But I think the eye leads to somewhere else, where the ones who haven't been heard still wait. At that moment, Ranger lifted his head and gently pressed his snout to Tommy's knee. Tommy rested his hand softly on the dog's head, whispering into the quiet. He hears what others ignore. Helen watched them, a child lost between memory and silence, and a dog who had once sniffed out the truth buried beneath soil and time. In the soft, early autumn light slipping in through the window, Tommy's drawing no longer felt like mere lines on paper, but rather like the frame of a door barely cracked open, leading into something far larger than memory. A cry for help that was only now beginning to be heard. Just as she was about to ask more, Jack stepped into the room, giving her a small nod before handing her a thick envelope. This just came in from Forest Hill County, he said quietly. There's a missing persons report that doesn't match any names, but this symbol, he pointed to the copy of Tommy's drawing on the folder's cover, just turned up at another scene. Helen turned to look at Tommy. He was still sketching, pencil tracing slow arcs across the page. But his eyes were no longer focused on what he was drawing. He was staring out the window, toward the fading afternoon light glinting through the swaying pine branches, as if something long asleep was being stirred awake. Helen spent the rest of that afternoon combing through missing child reports. The Timber Hollow shelter had never filed a case even remotely like the one involving the 5 recently found children. She tapped into the inter-county system, sorting through every entry that matched the most basic criteria: age, gender, estimated time missing. The results made her blood run cold. Only 2 of the 5 children had official missing person files. One was Ellie, reported missing by her father 3 weeks earlier in Salem. The other was Mark, a blond boy, last seen near Miller's Pond Park in the Eugene area. The remaining 3, no names, no reports, no one looking, no digital records, no known relatives, no listed place of origin, not even a single identification photo in the system. Helen shut her laptop slowly, her gaze locking on the stack of paper files in front of her. She opened each one, cross-referencing details, scanning for anything that could make sense of what they were seeing. And then, her eyes froze on a single overlooked detail. All 3 unnamed children bore faint scars on the inside of their left wrists, the same spot where medical ID bands are usually worn. Bands not meant for children, unless those children had once lived inside a medical facility, or worse, a facility kept hidden. She stood abruptly and left the room, her steps quick and heavy. Jack was sitting at the temporary police station's coffee machine in the community center. Ranger lay beneath him, eyes half closed but ears twitching, still alert. "Jack, I've got something," Helen said, lowering her voice. Jack looked up. 3 of the children don't have any official missing reports. No family came looking. But all of them. They've got matching scars, left wrist, right where a coded medical band or a tracking device would go. Jack furrowed his brow. "Are you saying they were monitored like property?" Helen nodded. "Or registered patients, possibly from an unlicensed orphanage, some kind of underground care center. I need access to the state's internal archives, the ones that store historical records from closed care facilities." Jack was quiet for a beat, then stood up slowly. "I'll get in touch with Evelyn. If the mayor authorizes a federal data unlock, we'll get a backdoor in. But Helen, if your theory is right..." Helen met his gaze and nodded before he could finish. If it was true, this wasn't just a kidnapping case. This was a network, coordinated, systematic, and it had been around for a very long time. That night, Helen sat alone in the dim light of her office, pulling up each decrypted file from the federal archives. Many of the names were faded. Birth dates were either missing or suspiciously altered, patient ID numbers overwritten. Then her eyes landed on a short note, buried at the end of a redacted document labeled Contingency Program. Eye of Quiet tracks nonverbal response patterns, noted prevalence among children under age 10 with reduced sleep reflexes and heightened auditory sensitivity. Assigned symbol, circle-I-/. Helen shot up in her chair. She snapped a screenshot, printed the file, and rushed toward the children's rest area. The nightlight cast a soft glow. Most of the kids were asleep, except for Tommy. He was sitting on his bed, holding Ranger in his arms, sketching under the faint beam of the desk lamp. But this time it wasn't the eye. It was a map. Helen stepped in and slowly sat on the edge of the bed. "Tommy," she said gently, "do you know where the other children are?" He didn't answer right away. His hand kept drawing, finishing one last detail. Then, without lifting his eyes, he whispered, "Not everyone gets a name." Helen's hand tightened slightly on her knee. "Did you ever see another place where they kept kids?" Tommy gave a slow nod, then pointed to the drawing, a patch of land marked with walls, corridors, and a broken pipe leading out toward the woods. "I heard sounds from the other side of the wall," he said softly. "Lullabies, crying, but I never saw their faces." "And the eye?" Helen asked. Tommy was silent for a long while. Then he looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time since his rescue. "It was everywhere. On the walls, on the clothes, on the metal plate behind the iron door." Helen held her breath. That last sentence hit her like ice. "Do you remember where?" Tommy nodded. "But only Ranger can find the way, because in that place—" He paused. "There are no human voices." Right then, Ranger stood up. No bark, no growl. Just quiet, deliberate stillness. His gaze locked on the half-open window, as if something outside had stirred or returned. "The dog?" The boy furrowed his brow, a flicker of doubt, not hatred, flashing in his eyes like a shadow crossing the sunlit surface of still water. "Yes, he's just above. If you step outside, you'll see him." The boy turned to glance at the other 4 children, then gave a barely perceptible nod. Jack pulled out his radio and called for immediate backup. While waiting, he stepped forward, extending his hand to each child one by one. The smallest girl let out a soft sob, her lips cracked and dry. Jack removed his jacket, wrapping it gently around her frail shoulders. The blonde-haired boy whispered, almost inaudibly, "We haven't eaten since yesterday." Jack rummaged through his pockets and brought out a protein bar and a small bottle of water, hardly enough for one, but the children shared it in silence, sip by sip, as if it were part of some sacred ritual. In that quiet moment, something felt off, a ripple beneath the still surface. Tommy's gaze. The boy hadn't looked away from Jack, not even once. There was no fear in those eyes, no retreat, no hunger, no thirst. He just stood there, still and steady, as if watching, as if measuring something invisible, weighing whether Jack was truly who he claimed to be. "What's your name?" Jack asked, his voice careful even. "Tommy," the boy replied. "I don't trust strangers." Jack gave a small nod. "That's smart. But sometimes, to survive, you have to decide who you'll trust." Tommy said nothing. Then suddenly, as if the thought had been burning at the edge of his mind, he asked, "Ranger, is he a canine dog?" Jack's eyebrows rose. You know about canines? I saw one. Once, a long time ago. Maybe in a dream, maybe for real. I'm not sure anymore. Tommy's voice dropped to a murmur, and his head bowed slightly. A little girl beside him, silent until now, spoke for the first time since Jack had entered the space. My name's Ellie, she said softly. We were just brought here yesterday. Was anyone else with you? Anyone who brought you in? Jack asked. Just one man. He wore a cap and always kept his face hidden. He didn't talk much, but he had a gun. Tommy whispered. He said this place was only temporary. Jack frowned. Temporary how? Ellie lifted her head, and in her eyes flashed something both unbearably sad and unnervingly resolute. There are others. Some are being kept somewhere else. Silence fell. The kind of silence that makes your heartbeat echo like footsteps in a tunnel. Ellie continued, her voice quickening slightly, as if she feared the memory would slip through her fingers if she didn't say it fast enough. Before they brought us here, I heard him talking to someone. He mentioned a transfer batch, something about the other group. What group? Jack pressed, leaning forward slightly. Older kids, more than 10 of them, Ellie murmured. They haven't been moved yet. They're still being kept somewhere. Ranger barked, 3 sharp, clear barks from above. Not panicked, not frantic, but precise. Urgent, like a reminder. Jack glanced toward the exit, then back at the children. We need to get out of here. Now! As he helped the last child climb up from the bunker, Ranger suddenly turned, his body twisting toward the left side of the barn where the tall grass began, and let out a low, guttural growl. Jack drew his gun, narrowing his eyes. Out in the field, something had moved. Not an animal, not wind. Something else. He dropped into a crouch, signaling Ranger to hold position. The dog stood firm, muscles taut, ears sharp, growl steady and deep like distant thunder. The stillness pressed in around them like heavy cloth. Jack backed slowly toward the children, motioning for silence. Into the truck, now, he ordered, never taking his eyes off the swaying grass. Only when he was sure no one was approaching did he shut the doors, lifting Ranger into the front seat. The truck roared to life, bouncing over the rugged dirt path toward the town of Cedar Run. The children were nearly silent the entire ride. Ellie clutched a ragged cloth doll to her chest as if it could keep her from falling apart. Tommy sat in the back seat beside Ranger, his eyes wide open, not speaking, not sleeping, his small hand resting on the dog's back, stroking gently with each breath. Ranger didn't look away from him either. The dog's tail would flick at any unfamiliar sound, but each time their eyes met, no words were needed. Helen, the only social worker on shift that afternoon, was already waiting at the community center. Her auburn curls framed a kind face behind round glasses, and her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had weathered many storms. When Jack introduced each child, she knelt to their level, smiling gently, reaching out to connect. But Tommy didn't respond. He stood beside Ranger, his eyes like ice beneath the surface of a frozen lake. When Helen extended her hand, he took a step back, clutching the dog's collar as if it were the only solid thing left in a world that had gone liquid and strange. Jack was about to say something, but before he could, Ranger lifted one paw, stepped closer to Helen, and sat. Tommy's gaze flicked toward the dog, wavered, and then, with the smallest nod, he said, "Only if Ranger stays?" Helen and Jack exchanged a quick glance. They understood. The bond between this boy and the dog was no longer just about trust. It was about survival. The next morning, Helen arrived early, carrying a few toys, a pack of colored pencils, and a fresh notebook. She sat down at the small table in the corner of the room, meant for special cases, where Tommy was seated with Ranger at his side. He was drawing, hunched close over the page, the lines of his pencil strong and certain, surprisingly controlled for a child who had only just stepped out of trauma. "What are you drawing, Tommy?" Helen asked softly. He didn't answer. Ranger lay beside him, head resting on the boy's leg. The dog's two-toned eyes were nearly closed, but his ears twitched at every breath Tommy took. Helen didn't press. She just waited, quiet and still. When Tommy eventually stood to use the bathroom, Ranger following closely at his side, she gently turned the notebook he had left behind. The paper was scattered with graphite marks, but in the center of the page, drawn over and over again, was a single image. A circle. Inside it, an eye. Sharp, knife-edged eyelids, a line cut cleanly through the pupil like a wound. Helen's brow furrowed. It didn't look like a child's doodle. It had intention, depth, obsession. She flipped back through earlier pages, the same symbol repeated at least 3 times, each time more detailed, each time darker. And in the corner of each page, a small dot, a mark, like a code. When Tommy returned, his eyes landed on the notebook. He paused just a beat when he saw it in her hands. He didn't scream, didn't panic. He just walked over, took it back, and turned to a blank page. "I don't want anyone looking inside," he said. His voice was calm, even, cold as river water. Outside, the wind had begun to stir the forest, rising slowly like a warning whispered through the trees, and somewhere, hidden within the heavy darkness of Timber Hollow, came a faint sound, so small it could almost be missed. The cold scrape of metal brushing against metal, echoing back from deep within the woods. At precisely 3 a.m, Jack turned the ignition. Ranger was already seated in the passenger seat, still and alert, his body quiet, but his eyes tracking every movement around them. Behind them were 2 vehicles from the federal tactical team, reinforcements dispatched from Forest Hill County. Tommy wasn't with them tonight, but before they left, he'd handed Jack a penciled sketch, a distorted, uncertain diagram of the terrain behind the old Miller farm, a place where Tommy said he used to hear crying coming through the earth. The forest behind the farmhouse was now cloaked in a thick veil of fog, the kind that settles deep and clings to the skin like old secrets. As soon as Jack cracked open the truck door, Ranger leapt down, landing without sound, and without waiting for a signal began threading his way through a moss-covered trail, nose low, shoulders shifting like liquid tension. Flashlights sliced through the haze like pale rivers of light, trembling with every step. Roughly 400 meters behind the main barn, beneath the older soil layer, Jack repeated to the tactical team, recalling Tommy's words. They stopped at a strange, flat patch of earth. No trees grew here. Grass barely reached ankle height, and the ground dipped slightly, almost as if nature had forgotten to tend to this place. Ranger moved in wide, slow circles, nose nearly pressed to the soil. Then, without warning, he snarled, low, guttural, and began digging sharply at one corner, his paws moving with forceful precision. "Here," Jack called out, dropping to his knees. As Ranger clawed away layers of dirt, a thin slab of concrete began to reveal itself beneath the mud and moss. It looked like any other piece of forgotten debris. But when someone shone the UV flashlight across it, a symbol appeared, barely visible under normal light, a circle, an eye, and a single slash. "That's the mark," Helen whispered, her breath catching in her throat. One of the agents brought forward the ground-penetrating radar. Within minutes, the machine began to hum and blink. "We've got a cavity under the concrete, over 2 meters deep, possibly a chamber." "Breach it," Jack said. The whirring of drills and the pounding of chisels broke the stillness. Dust and fragments filled the air. It took nearly half an hour to break through. Beneath the slab lay a dark steel hatch, embedded with a recessed handle. The lock had long since rusted. With a few firm strikes, the hinges snapped free. When they opened it, a wave of rot and decay hit them like a body blow. The stench of years locked away beneath soil, of things meant never to be found. Jack went first. Ranger followed without hesitation. The stairs descended into a narrow hallway with a low ceiling and walls lined in rusted tin and flaking metal. Each footstep rang with a cold echo. Flashlight beams danced across scratch marks gouged into the walls, and strange stains marked places where water had once forced its way up from the floor. At the far end, they reached a steel door, unlocked. Jack pushed it open. The air inside was thick, a suffocating mix of dampness and something sour, human, and long decayed. The flashlight moved slowly. 13 children. No screams, no cries, just eyes. Eyes sunken from hunger, hollowed by fear, stripped of everything except the instinct to survive. A small boy rested his head on the lap of an older girl, his eyes open but far away. Another child rocked gently on the floor, clinging to a torn sock like it was the only thing left that belonged to them. One had no hair. Another's arms were scratched raw, scabbed or infected. The air felt heavy, alive with quiet trauma. A girl stirred, barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" Jack crouched down. "I'm with the police. We're here to take you home." A younger boy murmured. "Last time, someone said that too, but they left." Helen stepped forward, removing her scarf and gently draping it over the trembling shoulders of the girl. "Not this time," she said softly. "I'm staying." One child hiccuped, then another. The silence cracked, like thin ice splitting under weight. The room trembled not from sound, but from emotion finally uncoiled. A tactical officer activated his radio, calling for immediate medical evac and transport. Jack began lifting the children one by one up the stairs into the open air. Ranger moved beside them with every trip, staying close enough to feel their breath, to count each heartbeat as if it mattered more than anything else in the world. The smallest boy, no older than 5, was carried into the arms of a medic. He didn't speak, but as he looked up at Ranger, a tiny smile broke through the grime on his face. "You know this dog?" Helen asked gently. The boy shook his head. "No, but I saw him in my dreams. Every time I wanted to disappear, he was there, outside the door, and he didn't leave." Helen turned toward Ranger, now sitting still beneath the trees, eyes locked on the bunker behind them. The lights of the arriving ambulances filtered through the leaves, casting a soft glow across the grass, warm and fragile. Jack looked to the agents. "We need to search the whole perimeter again. How many places like this are still out there?" No one answered. Because from the edge of the slope, where the trees began to thin, Ranger growled. And in that moment, from the far side of the woods, a shadow passed swiftly beneath the lights. Jack's hand flew up, signaling the team. "Hold your positions," he called, already moving. His flashlight and sidearm drawn, he charged after Ranger, crashing through low branches and tangled underbrush. The narrow trail dropped into a slope of loose dirt, where fresh footprints were still clearly pressed into the rain-softened soil. Ranger growled deeper now, his nose pulling him faster, then sharply turned right, to a patch of upturned earth, as if someone had slipped and scrambled up. Jack dropped to his knees. Boot prints, large, tactical grade, bearing a unique tread pattern. The left heel showed a tear in the rubber, creating an uneven imprint. Familiar. He motioned to a special agent behind him. "Run a search on every current and former security officer who had clearance near the Miller property, within a 10-mile radius." "You suspect someone?" Jack paused, jaw tight. Then answered, Harper. Deputy Miles Harper, once the quiet, disciplined security officer for Timber Hollow, later promoted to Jack's assistant, had always been a man of few words and strict routines. He blended in, worked hard, never made noise. But most importantly, he was the only one who ever had access to the old land registry blueprints of the Miller property. Months ago, Harper filed a quiet transfer request, citing family matters. Jack hadn't thought twice at the time. Now he did. Helen's voice cut through the comms from command. Jack, I just pulled the internal access logs. Harper tapped into the non-active farmland database. Miller's section, 2 months ago. No official reason logged. Jack gripped the wheel, his eyes fixed on the GPS tracking Harper's last known location, North Timber Hollow, near Whitestone Lake. He also used to work in Forest Hill before he transferred, Helen added. Might have had contacts there. Jack's eyes narrowed. Forest Hill. That's where the first I symbol was found. A thread was forming, fragile, but undeniable. By midday, inside the evidence processing room, forensic analysts were dusting objects recovered from the second chamber. Among the smears of grime on the steel handles, they found a single clean fingerprint. It matched no one on any federal trafficking database. And suddenly, the silence surrounding Timber Hollow didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like something that had been bought and protected for far too long. But when Jack entered the sample into Timber Hollow Police Department's internal system, one name emerged from the screen. Deputy Miles Harper. The room fell into a silence so complete, it was as if the air itself had forgotten how to move. There's no more doubt, Helen said, her voice low but steady, like a thread being pulled tight. He was at the scene. He may have been the one who redesigned the entryways. Or the one running the whole thing, Jack replied, his voice colder now, like stone set into steel. By late afternoon, they reached Harper's old cabin, an isolated structure crouched at the forest's edge, like a secret that never wanted to be found. The door was locked, windows sealed, the porch layered in the quiet dust of abandonment. But Ranger growled the moment they stepped onto the creaking boards, then let out a single bark, sharp and urgent. Jack didn't hesitate. He kicked the front door in with a force that echoed like a shot across the trees. The house was unnervingly still, dust floating in narrow shafts of fading light, no sign of recent life. But on the living room table there was a folder left open, pages slightly fanned, as if someone had been reading and fled mid-thought. Inside were old maps, blueprints of Timber Hollow's underground tunnel systems, some marked with the same haunting symbols they had begun to fear. A circle, an eye, and a line slashed clean through the center. Several tunnels were unfamiliar, uncharted. Helen flipped through the sheets with urgency. These aren't standard layouts. This is a routing system, organized by waves. And look, every timestamp, exactly 6 weeks apart. Transfers, Jack muttered, breath catching. He divided the children into batches, made it easier to control, harder to track. Then they found another sheet, handwritten names and dates listed in tight, hurried script. At the bottom of the page, next transfer November 6th, Station G, 13 kids. Helen's hand tightened around the paper. Station G. No one's found that location yet. Before Jack could respond, Ranger let out a sharp, clipped bark, eyes fixed on a darkened corner near the attic stairs. A wooden board looked slightly misaligned. Jack approached, tapped it lightly. Hollow. He pried it free. Behind was a narrow compartment, just large enough to conceal a small military-grade radio, still functional, and transmitting a single, looping message. Station G is ready. The next cycle will move through the northern line, Rendezvous set for November 6th. Moonless. Jack froze. That was 2 days away. By the time Jack returned to the lakeside cabin, where he and Helen had moved Tommy and Ranger for safety, night had settled in like a weight. But something felt wrong before he even opened the door. No movement inside. No familiar sounds. No soft clatter from the kitchen. No sprinting paws rushing to greet him. Just the scent of damp wood and a silence that crawled into his spine like ice water. He pushed the door open slowly, gun in hand. The beam of his flashlight swept across the living room. Empty. Then, from upstairs, a faint sound. A restrained bark. A breath held too long. "Ranger?" Jack called, his voice dropping into a hush like he feared the air might break. Ranger appeared at the top of the stairs, fur bristling, eyes wide, his mouth parted just enough to let out a low growl, deep and primal. Beside him stood Tommy, still in his pajamas, sketchbook in hand, pressed against the doorway like a shadow. "What happened?" Jack asked quickly. Tommy raised one hand and pointed toward the back window. "I saw someone standing out there." Jack stepped to the window, parting the curtain with care. In the pale wash of moonlight, he saw only the faint trail of a long shadow disappearing into the trees. "It was a person," Tommy whispered. "I saw the badge. Round, with a star in the middle. It caught the moonlight." Jack's jaw tensed. "You're sure it had a star?" "Positive?" Tommy nodded. It looked exactly like a police badge. Jack's heart pounded. They had found him. Not just him. Ranger. Ranger growled again, turning swiftly toward the back door that led into the yard. In a heartbeat, he was gone, launching into the dark with a velocity that tore through the quiet like a scream. "Ranger, come back!" Jack shouted, lunging forward, but it was too late. 2 minutes later, a furious bark rang out from the tree line. Jack grabbed his flashlight, sprinted into the night, his boots striking the damp earth in pounding rhythm, the wind in the trees hissing like distant voices. And then he saw him. Ranger, rigid and growling, paw planted firmly on a fresh boot print embedded in the leaves beneath a massive tree trunk. No person in sight. But the faint scent of gunpowder clung to the air like a warning left behind. Jack dropped beside Ranger, hand on the dog's neck. "Good job, buddy." But Ranger didn't respond as usual. His eyes were still locked on something, somewhere invisible, something no one else could see, as if he were guarding not a place but a memory, a ghost, a promise. The next morning, Helen arrived and stood speechless when Jack laid Tommy's latest drawing on the table. It was the badge, a 5-pointed star, encircled, a perfect match for the sheriff's department insignia. Helen turned to Jack. "Someone inside the department is involved." "Not just involved," Jack said, voice hard. "They're clearing the path for the next transfer, to Station G." Helen exhaled sharply. "Then, whoever it is knows where Ranger is, where Tommy is, where we are." "They don't want anyone left alive to tell the truth." Jack's eyes drifted to Ranger, who now sat alert by the front door, his posture like stone, his gaze unwavering, fixed on the forest wrapped in morning fog. A moment later, Jack's phone rang. Internal line. On the other end, a voice spoke in clipped urgency. "We've detected unauthorized access to the security system last night. The IP is internal, but the worst part, Ranger's tracker, his chip signal, has been traced for over a week." Jack gripped the phone until his knuckles whitened. They're targeting Ranger. He's the one link they can't control. And just then, Ranger growled again. Not a warning this time. A vow. Somewhere beyond the mist, an engine revved. Someone had just left, slipped into the woods like smoke. The following morning, Timber Hollow gleamed gold under the rich autumn sun. But to Jack, The light only deepened the weight in the air, like fine dust settling into lungs that could no longer exhale. The town hall, a relic of stone and red shingles that once hosted spring festivals and chamber concerts, now overflowed with townsfolk, not to celebrate, but to interrogate. A community meeting had been called after an anonymous article appeared in the local paper. The headline read, "Sheriff Nolan and the Canine Dog Tarnishing the Honor of a Peaceful Town?" The piece accused Jack of digging up ghosts, of targeting respected philanthropists like Mr. Richard Hale, and implied he was abusing authority to chase personal grief. And now Jack stood at the podium, alone, facing dozens of eyes that once trusted, now uncertain. But when Jack entered the sample into Timber Hollow Police Department's internal system, one name emerged from the screen: Deputy Miles Harper. The room fell into a silence so complete it was as if the air itself had forgotten how to move. "There's no more doubt," Helen said, her voice low but steady, like a thread being pulled tight. "He was at the scene. He may have been the one who redesigned the entryways." "Or the one running the whole thing," Jack replied, his voice colder now, like stone set into steel. By late afternoon, they reached Harper's old cabin, an isolated structure crouched at the forest's edge, like a secret that never wanted to be found. The door was locked, windows sealed, the porch layered in the quiet dust of abandonment. But Ranger growled the moment they stepped onto the creaking boards, then let out a single bark, sharp and urgent. Jack didn't hesitate. He kicked the front door in with a force that echoed like a shot across the trees. The house was unnervingly still, dust floating in narrow shafts of fading light, no sign of recent life. But on the living room table, there was a folder left open, pages slightly fanned, as if someone had been reading and fled mid-thought. Inside were old maps, blueprints of Timber Hollow's underground tunnel systems, some marked with the same haunting symbols they had begun to fear. A circle, an eye, and a line slashed clean through the center. Several tunnels were unfamiliar, uncharted. Helen flipped through the sheets with urgency. "These aren't standard layouts. This is a routing system, organized by waves. And look, every timestamp, exactly 6 weeks apart." "Transfers," Jack muttered, breath catching. He divided the children into batches, made it easier to control, harder to track. Then they found another sheet, handwritten names and dates listed in tight, hurried script. At the bottom of the page, next transfer November 6th, Station G, 13 kids. Helen's hand tightened around the paper. "Station G, no one's found that location yet." Before Jack could respond, Ranger let out a sharp, clipped bark, eyes fixed on a darkened corner near the attic stairs. A wooden board looked slightly misaligned. Jack approached, tapped it lightly. Hollow. He pried it free. Behind was a narrow compartment, just large enough to conceal a small military-grade radio, still functional, and transmitting a single, looping message. "Station G is ready. The next cycle will move through the northern line. Rendezvous set for November 6th. Moonless." Jack froze. That was 2 days away. By the time Jack returned to the lakeside cabin where he and Helen had moved Tommy and Ranger for safety, night had settled in like a weight. But something felt wrong before he even opened the door. No movement inside, no familiar sounds, no soft clatter from the kitchen, no sprinting paws rushing to greet him. Just the scent of damp wood and a silence that crawled into his spine like ice water. He pushed the door open slowly, gun in hand. The beam of his flashlight swept across the living room. Empty. Then, from upstairs, a faint sound, a restrained bark, a breath held too long. "Ranger?" Jack called, his voice dropping into a hush, like he feared the air might break. Ranger appeared at the top of the stairs, fur bristling, eyes wide, his mouth parted just enough to let out a low growl, deep and primal. Beside him stood Tommy, still in his pajamas, sketchbook in hand, pressed against the doorway like a shadow. "What happened?" Jack asked quickly. Tommy raised one hand and pointed towards the back window. "I saw someone standing out there." Jack stepped to the window, parting the curtain with care. In the pale wash of moonlight, he saw only the faint trail of a long shadow disappearing into the trees. "It was a person," Tommy whispered. "I saw the badge, round, with a star in the middle. It caught the moonlight." Jack's jaw tensed. "You're sure it had a star?" "Positive." Tommy nodded. It looked exactly like a police badge. Jack's heart pounded. They had found him. Not just him. Ranger. Ranger growled again, turning swiftly toward the back door that led into the yard. In a heartbeat, he was gone, launching into the dark with a velocity that tore through the quiet like a scream. "Ranger, come back!" Jack shouted, lunging forward. But it was too late. 2 minutes later, a furious bark rang out from the tree line. Jack grabbed his flashlight, sprinted into the night, his boots striking the damp earth in pounding rhythm, the wind in the trees hissing like distant voices. And then he saw him. Ranger, rigid and growling, paw planted firmly on a fresh boot print embedded in the leaves beneath a massive tree trunk. No person in sight, but the faint scent of gunpowder clung to the air like a warning left behind. Jack dropped beside Ranger, hand on the dog's neck. "Good job, buddy." But Ranger didn't respond as usual. His eyes were still locked on something, somewhere invisible, something no one else could see, as if he were guarding not a place, but a memory, a ghost, a promise. The next morning, Helen arrived and stood speechless when Jack laid Tommy's latest drawing on the table. It was the badge, a 5-pointed star, encircled, a perfect match for the sheriff's department insignia. Helen turned to Jack. "Someone inside the department is involved." "Not just involved," Jack said, voice hard. "They're clearing the path for the next transfer, to Station G." Helen exhaled sharply. "Then, whoever it is knows where Ranger is, where Tommy is, where we are. They don't want anyone left alive to tell the truth." Jack's eyes drifted to Ranger, who now sat alert by the front door, his posture like stone, his gaze unwavering, fixed on the forest wrapped in morning fog. A moment later, Jack's phone rang. Internal line. On the other end, a voice spoke in clipped urgency. "We've detected unauthorized access to the security system last night. The IP is internal. But the worst part, Ranger's tracker, his chip signal, has been traced for over a week." Jack gripped the phone until his knuckles whitened. "They're targeting Ranger. He's the one link they can't control." And just then, Ranger growled again. Not a warning this time. A vow. Somewhere beyond the mist, an engine revved. Someone had just left, slipped into the woods like smoke. The following morning, Timber Hollow gleamed gold under the rich autumn sun, but to Jack, the light only deepened the weight in the air, like fine dust settling into lungs that could no longer exhale. The town hall, a relic of stone and red shingles that once hosted spring festivals and chamber concerts, now overflowed with townsfolk. Not to celebrate, but to interrogate. A community meeting had been called after an anonymous article appeared in the local paper. The headline read, "Sheriff Nolan and the Canine Dog, Tarnishing the Honor of a Peaceful Town." The piece accused Jack of digging up ghosts, of targeting respected philanthropists like Mr. Richard Hale, and implied he was abusing authority to chase personal grief. And now Jack stood at the podium, alone, facing dozens of eyes, eyes that once trusted, now uncertain. The first voice to break the silence was Mr. Kessler, the town's pharmacist for over 30 years, his tone worn but firm, drawn from a place of deep personal memory. "I don't understand how you could question Mr. Hale, the man who helped fund the hospital when my daughter was battling cancer. He saved her life. And you've barely been here a year." Then came Mrs. Merrill, the retired schoolteacher, her voice quiet but laced with disappointment. "I know what you lost, Jack. Your wife, your child. But grief doesn't give you the right to suspect everyone else." Jack didn't answer right away. He looked down, not at the crowd, but at Ranger, who sat at the base of the podium, still as stone, his amber eyes reflecting something calmer, deeper than the storm of judgment surrounding them. In that one brief glance, Jack felt the anchor he'd been missing, a silent confirmation that truth does not always need a majority. "We don't investigate because we hate someone," Jack said slowly, each word steady, deliberate. "We investigate because children were held underground in our town, and someone with power tried to make sure no one ever found out." A hand shot up. "Do you even have proof?" From the back of the room, Helen stepped forward, raising a printed document. "Hospital records, a concealed donation from 1996, linked to a medical facility that doesn't exist on the state registry. The source of the transfer: Richard Hale." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room, but then Kessler's voice cut in again, sharper this time. "Or maybe it's just a coincidence?" The air cracked, like a frozen lake buckling under too much weight. The meeting began to unravel, voices rising, splintering. There were a few who backed Jack, but more stayed silent. And what hurt him most wasn't the opposition. It was the quiet betrayal of those who once stood beside him, now turning their eyes away. When the meeting finally dispersed, Jack walked slowly toward his truck. Ranger followed a few steps behind, the fading sunlight casting a long, stretched shadow of the two figures across the gray cobblestone walk. "Sometimes I wonder if I've lost my way," Jack whispered, not quite to Ranger, not quite to himself. "Maybe they're right. Maybe this is just me, chasing ghosts, using the pain as an excuse to go after the wrong man." Ranger stopped walking. Those amber eyes met his, not with judgment, not with doubt, but with the kind of quiet loyalty that required no proof, no justification, only presence. In that look, Jack found the one thing that still made sense, a bond that told him, "You are not wrong, and you are not alone." That evening, Tommy handed Helen a new drawing. It wasn't the eye, it wasn't a map. It was a man, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat, standing in front of a massive metal door. On the back of his coat, there was a police badge, crudely blacked out with pencil. And beneath the figure, written in the smallest, shakily drawn letters, "Station G is not the last." Helen's breath caught. "Who told you this?" she asked softly. Tommy shook his head. "No one. But I remember. Before they moved me, I heard someone whisper it. In a dream." Outside the window, Timber Hollow sank deeper into dusk. The clouds hung heavy over rooftops, pressing low with a silence that felt dense, unbroken. But far along the horizon, there was still a sliver of light, thin as hope, but undeniably real. Jack stepped out onto the porch, eyes tilted toward the darkening sky. Ranger moved beside him, settling in close. Beneath them, a fresh fax from federal headquarters lay on the porch railing. A satellite image, recently disturbed land. The note at the bottom read, "Zone G, confirmed active. Suspicious entry point detected at eastern coordinates." Jack gripped the paper tightly. His gaze followed the distant ridge that rose on the town's eastern side. A stretch of forest few dared enter, where cliffs broke into narrow ravines, and the old war-era myths still lingered in whispers. A place long avoided, a place long forgotten. "Let's go," Jack said. Ranger let out a soft, eager bark, as if he'd been waiting for this all along, then sprang from the porch, leading the way. By the time the pickup rolled to a stop near the trailhead, the last of the night had lifted from the treetops, giving way to the pale hush of early morning. Ranger jumped down, nose already working, body alert, tracking something invisible to human eyes. They moved for over an hour, over uneven rock, across tangled roots, through low fog and fallen trees, until Ranger stopped, his paws planted before a low cliff covered in thick vines. He let out a low bark, then began clawing gently at a mossy patch. Jack stepped forward, pulled back the vines, and his hand touched cold concrete. A wall, with a horizontal seam. A door. Hidden. Mechanical. Locked from the outside. Jack grabbed the crowbar. The door creaked open with a long, aching groan, the smell of mold and buried time hitting him like a wave. He stepped in. The space was small, stone walls lined with acoustic padding. Against the far side, rusted iron beds. On one lay a single child's shoe, a torn, stuffed rabbit, charcoal drawings smeared across the wall, and carved deep into the wall in jagged lines. Filtering. Waiting. "Secondary holding," Jack whispered. "They kept them here. To sort them." Ranger padded softly to a corner. There, beneath the dust, was a footprint. Fresh mud. A large boot. Left toe dragging slightly. Jack froze. That misaligned tread. Harper. No words needed. Jack gestured, and Ranger bolted, tracking the trail that twisted down a thick ravine, every step into the underbrush growing steeper, rougher, more treacherous. Branches snapped against their faces. The ground grew slick with hidden stone. And then, without warning, a gunshot tore through the air. The bullet sliced past Jack's ear, biting into his upper arm, sending him crashing behind a fallen log. Blood seeped through his sleeve. His hand shook as he drew his weapon. A voice rang out from beyond the trees, calm, mocking, familiar. "No one's supposed to come this far, Jack?" "Harper," Jack shouted back. "You really thought I'd stay silent?" "I didn't think," Harper replied. "I just knew you'd push too far." Another silence. Then, not a shot, but a sound. Ranger. A snarl split through the trees. Then motion. The shape of Ranger flew over the rocks, a streak of muscle and fury, straight toward the sound of the gun. There was a crash. Shouts. The scuffle of bodies. Heavy breathing. The thud of flesh hitting stone. Jack pushed himself up, clutching his arm, following the sound until he found them. Harper, swinging a broken branch, trying to keep Ranger at bay. But Ranger didn't attack. He circled, cutting off escape, herding Harper forward. Right toward Jack. "Stop!" Jack roared, gun raised. Harper froze. Ranger stood between them, chest heaving, but unwavering. Harper slowly raised his hands. I was following orders." "Whose orders?" Jack demanded, voice raw. Harper didn't answer, but in his eyes, behind the fear, there was something else. A resignation. As if this betrayal was only a piece of something larger. That night, inside the holding room of the station, Harper sat cuffed, silent. He had not spoken another word. The contents of his coat pocket revealed 3 items: a rusted key, a torn map, and an old keycard marked with fading letters. G2, Resource Management Unit. Helen looked at the map, then handed it to Jack. "This doesn't match the first Zone G. It's a separate branch." Jack stared at it. If this is G2, then Zone G is just one spoke in a much bigger wheel. "We've only seen the first floor." Outside, beyond the glass window, Ranger sat motionless, watching, listening. As the wind swept through the tall pines outside Timber Hollow, it carried with it a low, metallic groan, a door somewhere deep in the woods, closing in the dark. The next morning, Tommy sat down to draw again. But this time, he didn't avert his gaze from Helen. He opened the notebook deliberately, turned it to a fresh page, and pointed at the newest sketch. A tall man in a black leather coat, dark sunglasses obscuring any trace of expression, drawn with only a few pencil strokes, yet somehow radiating an unmistakable chill. His hand held a gun, not aimed at anything or anyone in particular, just there, always ready, as if it were not a weapon, but an extension of his body, and a quiet warning that silence was the only safe response. "He's the one who brought me to the first room," Tommy whispered. Never spoke, just stared. Helen bent down, steadying herself, her voice soft. "Do you know his name?" Tommy shook his head. "But my mom. She mentioned someone like him once, back when she still talked in her sleep. She called him the gatekeeper." Helen froze mid-breath. "Did she ever say anything else?" Tommy hesitated, then turned to the next page. Not another figure, but the symbol again. The eye. Only this time, beneath it, 3 letters had been scrawled in a trembling hand. E.W. Helen shot up from her seat. In the dim records vault of Forest Hill County's old health division, she pulled every archived file she could find connected to those initials. And there, buried under outdated patient forms and faded memos, was a name. Elena West, a former biochemical researcher who had once worked directly under Richard Hale. Her personnel file noted a sudden resignation in 1996 due to personal circumstances. After that, she vanished from every civil registry. But on the margin of a document that had never been digitized, an unassuming piece of a medical briefing left unopened for decades, Helen saw something that made her throat tighten. A faint, ink-stamped symbol. The circle, the eye, the slash, identical to Tommy's drawing. And beneath it, a line from an internal memo, typed in the old machine font of lab documents. Bioreactive sample, EW, exhibits heightened resonance with alpha wave emissions from subject G. Maintain subject 5 in isolation. Prevent maternal contact. Helen gripped the page, her fingers trembling. Subject 5 was Tommy. She immediately called Jack. At the station, Jack skimmed the document, his fist clenched hard enough to whiten the knuckles. "So," he said through clenched teeth, "Hale controlled Elena, and he used Tommy to keep her quiet." Helen exhaled, as if saying it aloud made it more unbearable. "She must have discovered something inside that project, and they silenced her, forced her to disappear." Jack stepped to the table, spreading the township map wide across the surface. "He didn't just build a system, Helen. He built a way to erase people, physically and administratively. Each child, a redacted data entry, a file with no origin." "And Ranger," Helen's voice dropped, reverent, "was the one variable he never predicted." Jack turned to the window. Outside, Ranger lay curled beside Tommy, 2 beings from different worlds, bound together by something beyond language. And in their silence, there was the echo of everything that had been stolen. Names, memories, freedom. "We're going to expose every corner of this," Jack said. "Hale's entire infrastructure needs to come into the light." Helen nodded, unlocking her phone and scrolling to one of Tommy's earlier sketches, the one of the metal door, the eye at its center. She zoomed in, and there, etched faintly to the right, was a nearly invisible sign. Origin, distribution, filtering. "This wasn't a holding facility," she said quietly. "It's a coordination center. If we find this place, we might get everything. Every name, every child that's still missing. Maybe far more than the 18 we've already recovered. Jack reached for his belt, hand tightening on the strap of his firearm. Coordinates? Helen turned back to Harper's old paper map. In the far corner, barely noticeable, was a red ink marking, near where a dry creek met the cliffside. Next to it, 3 italicized letters, EW Link. Jack's eyes lifted. Elena left us an entrance. And then, just as Helen reached for another folder, a soft thump sounded outside the station door. The wind had blown something under the frame, a sealed envelope. Ranger growled, low and alert. Jack stepped forward and picked it up. Inside was a single photograph, the back of a child, hands cuffed, seated in a dark room. On the wall behind them, smeared in something dark and glistening, were scrawled words, "There's still one more room." Jack turned toward Ranger. The dog was already on his feet, ears up, muscles taut. This wasn't a threat. This was a signal. Less than 15 minutes later, Tommy was gone. His temporary room stood eerily still, the window left slightly open, curtains swaying gently. On the floor, a crumpled sheet of notebook paper, a single line in a child's handwriting. "If you want to find Mom, follow the path of broken wood." Jack burst out the door. Ranger raced ahead, nose low, circling the porch before letting out a sharp bark and charging toward the tree line. "Tommy's been lured out," Jack shouted into the radio. "Lock down the station. He's making his next move. Now!" The western trail behind town was already sinking into darkness. Ranger ran ahead, weaving through dried roots and brush, each stride filled not only with purpose but something deeper, the instinct of one who had stood too often beside death and survived by feeling what others missed. Then suddenly, Ranger stopped. A patch of freshly disturbed soil between leaning trees. Tommy stood there, alone, trembling. Jack moved to sprint toward him, but the moment shattered. A single gunshot cracked through the air, not aimed at Jack. Aimed at Ranger, the dog lunged without hesitation, intercepting the bullet as it tore through the silence. A rough, broken whimper escaped as Ranger collapsed into the damp ground, his body jerking once before falling still. "No!" Jack screamed, sliding down the slope, gun raised. From the trees, Harper emerged, eyes manic, coat soaked in dew, rifle shaking in his hands. "You should have left it alone," he growled. "You were never supposed to get this far." Jack fired, 2 clean shots. One struck bark beside Harper's head, the other shattered the rifle from his grip. Harper crashed to the ground, dazed. The fight was short, but it had changed everything. Jack dropped to his knees beside Ranger. Blood seeped from the dog's shoulder, a sideways shot, angled, tearing through near the ribs. "Come on. Ranger, not like this." Jack's voice cracked with something deeper than fear, a breaking he couldn't hide. Ranger's breathing was shallow, but his eyes, they remained locked on Tommy, unmoving, fierce, as if to say, "You're alive. That's enough." Tommy fell beside him, cradling the dog's head. "Please don't die. Please don't leave me." Jack didn't hesitate another second. He lifted Ranger into his arms, sprinted toward the truck. Tommy ran behind him, silent tears tracing down his cheeks. The only veterinary clinic in the region was at the end of Maple Street. A faint porch light still burned. A blessing. Jack burst through the doors. "Emergency! K9 officer shot! Needs surgery now!" Dr. Sylvia, silver-haired, focused, her hands already moving, didn't ask questions. She pulled on gloves and pointed to the table. "Lay him down. I need 2 minutes to assess." Ranger was gently laid on the cold steel table, his eyes barely open, breath shallow and uneven, each rise and fall of his chest like a fragile ripple struggling to stay afloat in the vast stillness that filled the room. The vet began to shave the fur around the wound with swift, practiced hands, nodding for the injection of painkillers to be administered, her voice calm, but laced with urgency as she said, "No broken bones, but he's lost a lot of blood. If we move fast, he still has a chance." Jack stood just outside the operating room, the crusted traces of Ranger's blood still streaked across his cheek, like a mark he couldn't, or wouldn't, wipe away, as though erasing it would mean surrendering to the fear clawing at his chest. Tommy sat silently beside him, clutching his sketchbook tightly, his expression neither fearful nor tearful, just fixed on the narrow opening of the swinging door, eyes locked with a kind of desperate hope that looked almost like prayer. Helen arrived moments later, her hand landing gently on Jack's shoulder, her voice low but certain. "We're not going to let this happen again." Jack didn't answer, because in that moment, the only image that filled his mind, the only thing that mattered, was Ranger, lying there motionless, and yet somehow still guarding something deeper, something more sacred than even life itself. The sound of a surgical saw hummed inside the room. The operating light still burned overhead. And then, Jack's phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. He answered, breath caught in his throat, and through the static and distortion only a single sentence emerged. "The boy's mother. She's still alive." Jack froze, stunned, silent, but the call disconnected before he could speak. Helen had just entered the waiting room, her eyes searching his, a silent question hanging in the space between them. Jack simply nodded. "Any update on Ranger?" he asked, shifting the weight of the moment to the only thing his mind could still control. Helen shook her head slowly. "Sylvia's still suturing, but Tommy hasn't left his side, not even for a second." The operating room had since been converted into an intensive care unit. Ranger lay there, his large frame draped in a thin sheet, the wound now treated. Bleeding stopped, yet his breathing remained labored, thick and weighted like the silence in a storm's eye. A slender fourth line threaded into his leg, and his amber eyes, half closed, seemed to hover at the edge of awareness, as though holding tightly to something unseen and delicate, like a thread between worlds. Tommy sat beside him, not crying, not speaking, his small hand resting on the soft fur just beneath Ranger's neck, gently, rhythmically, as if trying to pass warmth from his own fragile body into the heart of the one creature that had never once let go of him. "I want to talk to him alone," Tommy whispered when Jack approached, his voice so soft it almost blended with the beeping machines. Jack nodded, stepping away without a word. Helen watched from the doorway, and in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, the shape of the boy next to the dog stretched long and tender. Two beings, different in form, but somehow, in that moment, indistinguishable in spirit. "You know something," Tommy murmured, leaning closer to the unmoving body beside him. "Back in that first room, everyone else cried. But I didn't, because I heard something different." His voice dropped to a hush, almost inaudible. "I heard your breathing, slow, steady, but warm. It didn't sound like fear. It sounded like knowing." He tightened his grip slightly on the blanket wrapped around Ranger's shoulder. "You heard me, when no one else did. When I didn't even have a name anymore. When they called me Case 5. Only you walked up, didn't bark, didn't flinch. You just looked me straight in the eyes." Ranger didn't move. Tommy blinked, then reached into his pajama pocket and pulled out something small, a torn, scorched scrap of cloth, embroidered with the name Tommy, its edges frayed, stained by years of hiding, of holding on. "I think my mom made this for me. I don't really remember her face, but I remember the way the cloth smelled when I held it in my sleep. And I remember the first time you sniffed it, you barked 3 times, like you knew what it was. He gently placed the scrap of cloth on Ranger's paw. "Now it's my turn to keep a piece of you, but you have to wake up, because my mom's still out there, waiting." Tommy's voice faltered. He swallowed hard. The bedside lamp flickered. And then, the slightest motion. Ranger's tail twitched. Not much, but enough for Tommy to gasp. "You heard me, didn't you?" Though his eyes remained closed, Ranger's leg tensed slightly, a small subconscious reflex, as if reaching back through the fog, drawn by the boy's unwavering belief. Tommy began to cry, not the kind of crying that comes from fear or grief, but the kind born of hope breaking open, bright and sudden, like sunlight spilling into a locked room. Moments later, Dr. Sylvia entered, scanning Ranger's vitals, then speaking with cautious relief. "He's still conscious, just barely, but he's responding to emotional contact. That's a very good sign." Jack stood outside the glass, watching. Helen leaned closer and whispered, "He's not just a dog. He's the first being who made Tommy feel like he was worth hearing." Jack nodded, eyes fixed on Ranger's body. So big, so battered, yet still radiating a warmth that made promises words never could. His phone buzzed again. A message. No sender. Just a single line and a set of GPS coordinates. "Where Elena's being held. Bottom floor of Sector G2. Jack clenched the phone in his hand, jaw tightening. Ranger was alive. Tommy's mother, Elena, was alive, and someone out there still needed to be pulled from the dark and brought into the light. He turned to Helen. "We're not waiting anymore." The estate of Richard Hale stood by the shores of Whitestone Lake, silent and imposing, the very image of old wealth and cultivated perfection. A mansion of gray stone and red cedar, its pathway lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and cobblestone steps, once graced by politicians, philanthropists, and those the people of Timber Hollow revered without question. 9 a.m. A coordinated strike team from the FBI and state police moved in from 3 directions, their approach swift and silent, every step calculated. Jack led the rear team, his eyes like tempered steel, voice sharp through the comms. "No noise! Take him alive!" The moment they breached the back door with a silent charge, Hale knew it was over. He stood in the study, crisp white shirt unwrinkled, glass of wine in hand, eyes devoid of emotion, as if this was all some formal inevitability. "What a waste," Hale said quietly. "I thought you'd stop chasing ghosts." "You were wrong," Jack replied, snapping cold steel cuffs onto the man's wrists. "I was just waiting for the right moment." In the mansion's lower archive, agents uncovered stack after stack of files, coded notebooks, lists of children categorized by batch, medical reports, experimental notes, and maps marking transfer routes. Each page a twisted piece of the truth. Each symbol a child treated like a unit of inventory. Helen found a locked metal cabinet. Inside, maps of the underground system, including sectors G and G2, and a corridor without a label, marked only by one name, the lowest floor. "It's here," she said, pointing at coordinates that matched the anonymous message Jack had received. The team moved fast. Sector G2 turned out to be an abandoned warehouse east of town, masked as a charitable food distribution center. Beneath a false concrete floor lay a steel hatch leading down into the darkness. And at the lowest level, dank, forgotten, wrapped in mildew and silence, they found it. Not emptiness, but memory, pain, proof. In the far corner of the room, tucked behind a cracked wall panel, they found a broken wooden compartment, hollow inside, as if long forgotten. Jack reached in carefully and pulled out a tin box wrapped in layers of old newspaper, yellowed and brittle with age. He opened it. Inside lay a short, handwritten letter, a tiny necklace braided from thread, and a faded copy of a sonogram. The image nearly washed away by time. Helen took the letter with both hands and read it aloud, her voice catching with every word. To Tommy. If you're alive to read this, it means I failed in my promise to protect you. But I never stopped loving you. Not for a single breath, not through a single night in the dark. I kept your face in my heart like a small light. Don't be afraid, my love. Follow the light, and always remember, someone is listening. Mom, Elena West. No one spoke for a long while. The only sound was the wind slipping through the vents in the old walls, soft as breath. Jack's eyes dropped to the floor, the tile worn, uneven, and slightly raised. Sylvia, who had accompanied the forensic team, stepped in, examined the area swiftly, then looked up and confirmed quietly. A female skeleton. Still wearing a bracelet, engraved with the initials EW. Helen took a step back, fingers tightening around the edge of her jacket. She died in 1995, probably right after hiding these. Silenced before the truth could escape, Jack said, voice low, almost reverent. By the time they drove back, the sun was high, but the light felt softer, less sharp, as if the world itself had just passed through something heavy and emerged quieter, more real, even if not yet whole. Tommy reached out with both hands as Helen gave him the thread necklace. He held it as if the years it carried might slip away if he gripped too hard. The threads were twisted in 3 colors, white, blue, and brown, the same colors his mother used to wear. He didn't cry. He only whispered, I heard her voice last night, in my dream. She left you something final, Jack said gently. Tommy looked up at him, and in his eyes was something brighter than tears, something steadier than grief. And now, Tommy said, voice quiet but sure, I'll tell the others. The ones who still haven't been found. Helen opened the old map again. Beyond G2, there were still 2 paths, faint and unclear. One led beyond Whitestone Lake, a zone no one had dared investigate before. Jack adjusted the strap of his sidearm, his face hardening. Hail was just the surface. There's a whole system, buried for too long, and still breathing beneath us. Outside the station window, Ranger lay stretched out on the grass, not yet fully healed, but the golden glint had returned to his eyes. Every time Tommy came near, Ranger's tail gave a small, steady wag, slow but meaningful. Their eyes met, the boys and the dogs, like the last 2 puzzle pieces finally fitting into the shape of trust. And then, the alarm from the federal network echoed through the room. Helen turned to her monitor. Signal detected in southern Timber Hollow, match code G-3. There was still another system to confront. But before that, Jack knew there was one thing he could no longer put off. 1 week after Hale's arrest, the town began to breathe again. Timber Hollow, long asleep beneath a veil of denial, slowly began to awaken. Families who had adopted children through shadowy intermediaries came forward, offering statements, confessions, regret. And in the middle of that quiet reckoning, Jack filed a petition with the local court. A request to adopt Thomas West. The presiding judge, an elderly woman named Sinclair, took her time reviewing the file. She looked once at Jack, then at Tommy, sitting beside Helen with a pencil in his hand, and Ranger curled beneath his chair. This child has no legal family, she began softly. But he has a dog that protected him with its life, a man willing to lay down his badge to become his father, and a doctor who confirms that the boy began speaking again only after being with these 2. Jack didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Judge Sinclair nodded, tapped her gavel once. From this day forward, Thomas West is the legal son of Jack Nolan. The small wooden house by the lake had been repainted. Its old, weathered brown gave way to a soft, warm cream. String lights were draped across the porch, glowing gently each night. Jack had built a handmade sign hanging at the front gate. A house for 3 souls and 1 hero. Tommy ran inside, arms full of new art supplies Helen had gifted him. Ranger followed behind, slower, careful, but with perked ears and a steadier step. The guest room had become Tommy's bedroom. Its blank walls were now alive with color, forests, slivers of light through cracked doors, hands reaching through darkness, and one large drawing of Ranger standing in front of the wooden house, gazing toward something unseen. Jack stood in the doorway, saying nothing, just smiling. In that quiet moment, life, once nothing but fragmented static, had begun to hum again. Not perfect, but real. That evening, all 3 sat on the porch steps. Jack poured tea. Tommy passed around cookies. Ranger lay at their feet like a living rug, eyes half closed. "Dad," Tommy asked, "if there are still other kids out there waiting, will we go?" Jack set his cup down, ruffled the boy's hair. "I think, when you know someone needs you, you don't walk away." Tommy nodded, then placed his hand gently on Ranger's back. "Then next time, I'm coming too." Ranger stirred, lifted his head. His gaze met Jack's, waiting for permission. Jack chuckled softly. "If Dr. Sylvia agrees, I probably couldn't stop either of you." Tommy disappeared into the house and came back moments later with a sheet of paper. He held it up proudly. It wasn't a map of G-zones anymore. It was a drawing of a home for children who used to have no names. It had an art room, a playground, a forest nearby, and tucked away at the edge, a small cabin just for Ranger. Its roof labeled with a hand-carved sign, "The First Listener." Night fell slowly. The kitchen light spilled outward, illuminating the page in Tommy's lap as he added new strokes to the vision taking shape. He drew with hands that no longer trembled, every line a piece of memory, not shaded in fear anymore, but filled with color. Beside him, Ranger breathed softly, his head resting on Jack's knee. He no longer ran between life and death, but held the role he was born for, the first to listen, the first to make a silent boy speak. The night wind passed gently through the window, but this time, it didn't carry cold. It brought the scent of fresh timber and a soft chime from the front gate. Someone had arrived. 1 year later. The Timber Hollow farm, once the starting point of a nightmare, had changed. The rotting wooden doors were gone, replaced by white stone paths, lavender gardens, and pine-covered walkways where silence no longer felt like fear, but healing. What was once the first underground chamber, cold, hidden, and hollowed by silence, has now been reborn as the Lightkeeper Memorial Park, a place not built with walls or gates or cameras, but with names carved into permanence, each one a child once lost, now found, now remembered. There are no fences here, no warnings or watching eyes, only simple stone benches arranged in a wide circle around a central space where the largest sculpture in the park stands, a statue of Ranger. Cast in bronze, the statue captures him in a stance both noble and eternal, standing tall, head raised, eyes gazing far beyond the horizon, as if still watching over something no longer in sight, but never out of reach. And at the base, hand carved into the dark stone with the care of someone who knew the weight of silence, is a single line. He heard the cry no one else could. This morning, just as the first sunlight crested over the eastern ridge and spilled across the grass like a soft unveiling, Tommy arrived at the park with a group of children from the shelter. The same children who, not long ago, had lived in the shadows of places like G2 and G3, now walking freely under open sky, each one carrying not just a name of their own but a story, a voice, a hand-drawn picture that now hangs on the walls of rooms they call home. Tommy stopped in front of Ranger's statue, a small bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. Flowers carefully grown around the edge of the old cabin Jack and Helen had turned into a quiet waypoint for newly rescued children finding their first refuge. There was a time when we had no names, no voices, Tommy said, almost a whisper, as he placed the flowers at the foot of the statue. But Ranger, you heard the things no one dared to hear. Not far behind the benches, in the shade of a tall sycamore, the real Ranger lay. Older now, slower in step, the years written gently into the graying of his muzzle, but his eyes still held that same unwavering light, the same watchful stillness, like a flame kept lit through storm and stillness alike. He didn't care much for noise anymore, nor for crowds, but today, of all days, he had made his own way to the park, choosing, without cue or command, the one seat that faced the statue directly, as if standing guard over both the past and whatever future these children would make for themselves. Dad said there'd be a surprise today. Tommy grinned, his face lighting as Jack approached with a small wooden box cradled carefully in his arms. Ranger lifted his head, catching the scent of oak and paper and the soft perfume of something cherished. Jack opened the lid. Inside lay a new leather-bound notebook, the color of deep forest green, and a pen engraved with the initials, T and R. "For the stories you'll write," Jack said, his hand resting gently on his son's shoulder. "Not everyone knows how to tell them, but those who've lived them, they must, so that even those who never knew can still learn to understand. And to care." Tommy opened the first page. He wrote his first line. Then he looked up toward Ranger and smiled. "We were once the ones left behind, but not anymore." Ranger blinked slowly, then lowered his head onto Tommy's foot, settling into stillness once again. And in the soft morning light, their shadows stretched long across the gravel path, not as an echo of something gone, but as a mark of something just beginning. A journey not meant to end, but to go forward.